Thanks very much. What we're going to do now is, if you have questions and you're in Biddeford, there'll be index cards that you can drop up to me. If you are on one of the other sites, there you can send through the chat to, I think it's GSM Questions. GSM Questions here. Just put your questions in there, and somebody will get them up to me. I'll try to sort of balance all the different questions that we get. While we get organized, a little bit of an anecdote. Anthony mentioned that the town of Brookline, Massachusetts has 60,000 people in it. For context, the city of Hallowell, Maine has 2,500 people. So forms of government don't necessarily relate to size. And actually, I think that's one of those things I'd like to get into. So maybe I'll use moderator's privilege while we're getting started and ask the speakers about that. You know, it's not just home rule versus regional or state governance, but does the type of home rule make a difference?
That may be a question best for Anthony, but I will interject that clearly town meeting government becomes more difficult at scale. The reason we in Maine and other places in New England switch is at a certain point, town meetings become unmanageable. I'm impressed that Brookline is doing this, given that if Brookline were in Maine, it would be the second largest city in the state after Portland. So the fact that you're able to pull that off is, to the extent you do, congratulations.
Anthony, thoughts on that?
Well, it is being fiercely opposed. You can be sure. The same neighbors who don't want certain things to change don't want the form of governance to change, it's really wonderful. But there is this attachment to local democracy. It's messy and it isn't always pretty, but so many residents, particularly long-established residents, want to stick with that form of governance.
Great. So we have our first question, and this is to Colin. Does your historical research point to factors that facilitate actions at the regional level beyond local?
In history and in our past?
Yes.
Well, going back into our deep past, that's a great weakness in Maine, right? We're fractured into, it's like the German Confederation before Bismarck, right? We've got all these thousands of principalities and duchies and grand duchies that, control many of their own aspects and don't trust one another, right? Boothbay and Boothbay Harbor, never the twain shall meet, and the like. So those are always been challenges. What I will say is that, it is striking when you go out elsewhere in the country. I did this series in 2016 for Politico magazine called What Works. It was a series of 5,000-word magazine articles on a successful urban innovation somewhere that's so cool everybody should know about it. So that was the only criteria. So I was going out all over the country and looking for those things. Homeless initiative in Albuquerque, recreating an industrial park in Milwaukee, regeneration of a community in Roanoke, Virginia, in a former tobacco town of Winston-Salem, South Carolina, the creation of the light rail system we just talked about in Denver with its transit-oriented development, and so on. But what struck me as I was doing the series, even though I wasn't selecting for these things, is in almost every single instance, I discovered this commonality, which was that somehow in each of these metro areas, they had been able to convene and cooperate on a broad scale between municipalities, between the suburbs and the city center, and also within society, the philanthropists and the Fortune 500 guys and the city officials and the politicians and Republicans and Democrats and the punk rockers and everybody were somehow able to convene to solve a problem they knew they all had, right? There was something missing in the metro area and they knew that government would be incapable of doing it for various reasons and that the private sector wouldn't be able to do it for other incentive reasons, and the two needed to come together, and they were able to convene. And I realized over and over again there were two things that we never have in Maine. We don't have a convener that naturally everyone turns to who could suddenly say, knights come together, let's solve something, right? We don't have that at any kind of state level, those informal networks. And these leaders weren't an elected official, they were someone in the community who had the power to draw them in. Maybe you would in one community or one sector, but not in the broad scale. And also that we don't see that level of cooperation at any scale between all these municipalities and stuff. So in a negative example, the things that have caused these other places to be able to make big bets on themselves and do these things are exactly where our weaknesses lie. So I think the summit is very correct in focusing on this particular element because our historical record shows quite a bit of weakness in this regard. I mean, you can find various initiatives, but in the end, we're still standing here talking about this even though we've identified this as a problem, now decades ago.
Anthony, do you have anything to add to that?
No, let's turn to let's keep going.
Great. Okay, next question, I'll send this to Anthony first. If we could build from scratch, how do we determine the appropriate scale for decision making and planning?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that the way Colin has traced it back, there's a little bit of trial and error, and a little bit of needing to meet very practical and urgent needs. And so, you really could look at it as, why do we have this system? What is it really good for? But I think in spite of all of that, the spectrum or the transect, if you will, from the block, the neighborhood, the city, the state, the region, take someplace like New England, and then the mega region, say for example the Northeast Corridor, is not a bad nesting of government scales. And I think, though, you can look around at other places, and I mean, it sounds terribly wonky, but they call it territorial cohesion in Europe. And it really does make sense in terms of aggregating and strengthening these economies across a broader scale. And so if I was going to reinvent anything, I would figure out a way to institute more regional planning. And I'm sure Colin has some comments as well, so I might turn this over to him as well.
Great, Colin, do you have anything to add?
Well, mine may be, less informed in that, I don't work actively in this space. I don't have the technocratic skills, so you should definitely look to others for those kind of things. But just contextually, as an observer of the history and the background and reporting on these things, my observation would be, I think the answer to the question depends on the problem you're trying to solve. That the scale of, say, planning for railroad transportation initiatives and all that would be different than the scale of if you're trying to plan around how do we deal with big box stores, right, which operate, Walmart wants a 25,000 person catchment area, which is bigger than some of our counties. Yet we're working with, they can play one municipality off another. So, which problem you're dealing with probably answers the scale, and I'm assuming that the answers we work with are going to be bottom-up ones where towns agree to associate with one another for various purposes. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that the effective and appropriate scale for each of those things would be different depending on the problem at hand.
Great. Several questions on a similar theme, and this has to do with how you actually might get to regional planning. Clearly, at times, there's been successes. At one point, there was more annexation going on of communities as transportation got better. In Maine, there's been disincorporation of towns that have realized they don't really need to be anymore. How do you incentivize regional thinking, or mandate? What are some approaches that might work? And I'll have Colin start if you look.
I don't have a strong answer, again, because I don't work into this field, so I'd defer, actually. I'd be interested in what the experts who work on this day-to-day think.
All right, Anthony.
Well, the question relates to, can you rephrase the question?
Sure, and I think it's a little open-ended, but once we've decided there are things that are best served at a regional level, how do we get there? How do we get these home rule communities to agree to do so? One case many people may be aware of in Maine is the effort to consolidate regional transit in the Portland region. There's 7 regional transit districts in the Portland region, and it's been very difficult to have a good conversation about that. So how do you get people to realize when regionalism makes sense, and what do you have to do to get there?
Well, I think it's an ongoing task, and I think that making the case has a lot to do with demonstrating the economic benefits to everyone. And so take affordable housing. If you look at the rebooting New England proposal, this idea of high-speed rail linking places like Hartford and opening up the Hartford housing market, this would address people who can't afford to live in Brookline or other places around Boston. And that frustration, I think, is very, very real and palpable. You can make the case for this more regional framework by suggesting that you can use high-speed rail to get around. If we just expand our thinking in terms of the region, you will be able to find a great place to live that's very affordable. These sort of kitchen table pocketbook issues would be one way to talk about how a more regional approach makes sense.
I actually have a thought as well. I mean, of course, any effort to impose top to bottom regional solutions on unwilling, home rule, municipalities and jurisdictions is going to raise a great deal of opposition and be difficult. So the ideal clearly is where you can to have the decision, to encourage a context where the facts are looked at on the ground and people realize their self-interest and work together upward. And I was thinking about that because one of the stories I looked at when I was doing that series was on Utah, the Envision Utah effort, which was essentially the largest land use and economic development planning exercise that's been done anywhere in the country. And it's done in Utah, right in the far west, right? Individual rights and freedom, strongly Republican state. And yet, everyone started realizing in the technocratic community, looking at the numbers, that everyone in Utah essentially lives in this strip of towns between, Provo and Ogden, with Salt Lake City in between in this one valley. And there wasn't, if you looked at the projections of how fast the state was moving, there wouldn't be enough water, transportation, or anything for the valley. You could extrapolate what a mess this was going to become, and it was going to undermine everything that Utahns like about Utah, all the way down to the communitarian experiences and the values and stuff of the LDS community that helped found it. And so the realization was there, but the idea that state or anybody else would impose this, we need light rail, you need smaller incentives for smaller building sizes, you need to plan out these things so that there's enough water and stuff to go around, so that there's affordable housing, so your kids can live where 40 years from now, your kids and grandkids will be able to live in this valley near you. And so what they did was they intentionally organized it all. They created these big listening sessions through a private-public partnership nonprofit groups, invited everyone, kind of put the questions out there in the data and kind of let people sort of figure out the different scenarios themselves. Which Utah would you like to live in? Scenario A, B, C, or D? This is where we do nothing, this is where we do this and that. And those convening sessions, which were quietly backed by a lot of the powerful people in Utah, but not formally, allowed all of these people and constituencies and stakeholders to realize, oh my gosh, we don't want the standalone do nothing, we need C or B. And they ended up being able to create this broad-based support to go ahead and build an entire light rail system and set up all these long-term planning, which is now extended across the entire state of Utah. So some lessons like that about how to do things where initially the ideas you're putting forward are going to raise a hornet's nest and of opposition, Utah found a way around that. It's a different social and political context than ours, but the similarities between what you're trying to do of a bottom-up sourcing and how you encourage a bottom-up conversation to happen, I think there's some remarkable lessons there and probably in other places in the country that I think are fungible to the task ahead for us.
Great. Another question. Maine, like a lot of states, isn't really set up to review projects that have regional impacts, developments of regional impact. A community will approve a project within its boundaries, and other than a few state actions like a traffic movement permit, it's mostly a local decision. What are some examples of places that have been able to look at those regional impacts in a more holistic way, with some teeth, with some ability to actually affect projects?
I don't think I have a good
Well,
answer.
I guess I'll jump in.
Okay.
The Metropolitan Area Planning Council in Boston, in the Boston area, I think it's 110 communities in greater Boston. That's our regional planning agency. And there are several others across the Commonwealth. In terms of teeth, that lies mostly with the MPO. It also serves as the MPO, and there is a great deal of structure there. Of course, that relates to transportation infrastructure. Otherwise, they have the bully pulpit, and they arguably need to get better and better at communicating about the value of looking at the impact of various choices in land use and development on that regional scale. When I say my first book was called This Land, The Battle Over Sprawl and the Future of America, and I was always fascinated about how various towns in greater Boston and out towards 495, the second beltway, they put all their big box stores, and I mean, this is a tried and true method, right? You put all the big box stores and the traffic generating thing at the edge of town. So the neighboring town has to deal with it, and good luck with that. Not much communication going on there. So I feel that pain. But regional planning agencies have kind of struggled to confront that.
Great. Another question relates to post-COVID recovery and perhaps opportunities to take advantage of disruption in a positive way, and perhaps look at whether we might need some regional structures to help best recover from the pandemic, as opposed to relying on each community to sort of take care of its own permitting and development system as we move forward.
I think the answer is going to be yes. I mean, the pandemic, which is probably going to go on in effect for another year or so before life might return to something of normal, is going to have disrupted the whole way we live and function. We're not even moving around in the same sense. I mean, we're starting to become localized in our communities because we can't leave and can't go anywhere to convene. But that may leave a hangover effect, and people are reassessing. Do we need this office or as big a one? What meetings are required? Does it really make sense for me to spend the next hour and a half of my day in a car, rather than just starting meetings like I've been doing for the past year and a half? All of those questions will be answered all over the country, including Maine. So, we've been forced into reassessing our assumptions all of a sudden. So yeah, it's going to give us an opportunity to consider these kinds of questions, and probably coupled, I would imagine, with a considerable external stimulus money is probably going to have to be brought to bear by the federal government sometime in all of this process that could be capitalized on. Now, how is that going to look? In Maine, how are we going to do those regional things? I think that's a totally separate question, but I'm certain that it's on the agenda and it's an opportunity that we have and ought to seize as you're trying to deal with these issues.
Great. Anything to add to that, Anthony?
Yeah, so I again would refer to that City Lab piece in April, where as a practical matter, these different states had begun to coordinate, not only on procurement for personal protective equipment, but on the recovery, as I suggested. Another interesting feature about this topsy-turvy situation that we're all in is that there's a little bit of a silver lining in that cities are making rather speedy progress in reshaping the public realm. It's remarkable if you think about it, the way that parking spaces have been turned over to streeteries, and like as in the Slow Streets initiative in Oakland, of course, many other cities turning over more of the public realm to biking and walking, and of course, those modes of transport are very much de rigueur at this time, and of course, also greener. The construction in public works has actually had a chance to get sped up because of the lack of traffic, and the cities are ghost towns, and that is an opportunity to work hard at various elements, anticipating this post-COVID future.
Great. Another question related to home rule. One of the advantages and disadvantages of home rule, as you both mentioned, is the idea of the volunteer and the fact that you have local boards that have volunteers that live in the community. One of the challenges we're seeing, particularly in Maine, where there's a number of towns that are not very big, is getting people to fill these seats. It's harder and harder to get volunteers to participate in these boards and commissions, to the point where sometimes they can't even fill all the seats. But what role might that play in pushing towards regional solutions? Or is there a way to sort of figure out how to get people to reinvigorate that volunteer base?
Right. Well, that's one of the big questions, right? Professionalism by default. I mean, you see it in all sorts of things. EMS services, for instance, that used to be all volunteer, and there aren't as many volunteers, and the demands on EMS services are larger, and the technical requirements and the training. You need people who are actually paid a salary to go out and do all this stuff. That's true in so many elements of 21st century life. And coupled with, despite that legacy and heritage we have of sort of communitarian civic involvement, obviously that's declined over time, as it has everywhere in the country, technology and everything else playing a role, and with that there's less volunteers and less people showing up. So yeah, it's going to push some communities to realize they have to do otherwise because the status quo doesn't work anymore. And in some communities there may be an effort to revitalize those things. How do you revitalize things? I mean, I think you have to have contexts where people can participate, where they feel like their participation is having a meaningful effect, right? If there are going to be new innovations that contribute towards the regionalization and economic development and social development and civic goals we have, finding ways in which the volunteer and the prospective elected office holder can meaningfully participate in those things is a way to jumpstart those functions. It also reduces costs if you have an effective volunteer basis who does that. But you're working against demographics. We live in an older and ever aging state, and fewer and fewer young people around to reinvigorate the population, and the frenetic pace of 21st century life, and people juggling jobs and kids, and sometimes having to have multiple jobs to make ends meet. It's harder to have time to volunteer and all that. So those are the things you're working against.
Yeah, I would just add, I think at the local level, there has in some places been almost a resurgence of interest and activity, particularly among young people. And I would point to, again, the Yes in My Backyard movement. In the Bay Area, elsewhere in California, and again, even in Brookline. This group, which essentially just promotes more multifamily housing or addressing affordable housing, by adjusting these various zoning policies and other things, there's one of their members is trying to get on a local board. They're running for the board of select board. They're serving on neighborhood associations, and using, and I think this is really important, using social media and a Facebook page and so forth to really organize pretty effectively. And before you know it, there could be a small majority of yes in my backyard housing advocates in a town meeting or on a particular town board. So in terms of volunteering, I think there is hope. Now, if you look at Brookline and San Francisco, these are particular kinds of communities, where there's almost like competition to get on the local board, and that there might not be that luxury of having that civic interest and activity in other places. So I certainly understand that. But anyway, I would just point to Yes in My Backyard as an example of regular citizens getting involved in local democracy.
I mean, in terms of like providing context, I mean, there's always, it's an important thing to identify because there's going to be a tension between maintaining or growing a volunteer base and the implications of regionalization, right? That's kind of the themes in the talk I was talking about how those things are often end up being zero sum, and you want them not to be and figure out ways to minimize that. Like I was just thinking about EMS while we were sitting here, why is EMS professionalized? Well, we have a whole bunch of new techniques. People can save lives they couldn't have before, but in a way they have to and keep people alive because we regionalized our hospitals, right? The hospitals are all becoming hub and spoke. It's not your local hospital. In almost every instance, you're going to be transferred somewhere else to do most procedures. The ambulances have to do those procedures. They have to people to keep you alive to do them. So the very fact of regionalizing and making the hospitals more efficient has forced outward implications for the volunteer sector where they have to professionalize because of the burdens being placed on them. And you can play that out in all sorts of contexts. So that's one of the things, that I don't have a solution, but that's one of the problems which if we could mitigate, it would be to our good of figuring out ways to minimize that transfer that happens where you lose the civic engagement and the volunteer engagement as the professional demands grow, which they usually do when you consolidate your fire department from volunteer fire departments to a consolidated county one or whatever you're doing.
Sure. I mean, I think clearly EMS is seen as one of those regional successes, the 911 call centers, some transportation efforts. One of the consolidation efforts in Maine that has been seen as less successful is school consolidation. That's been a real challenge and sort of stuck in a partial implementation phase to some extent. Any thoughts on that, on the idea of regionalizing schools?
I'll briefly jump in because I live in Freeport, which is RSU 5, which is one of those arranged marriages that haven't worked out all that well. The three towns, Freeport, Pownell, and Durham, don't quite see eye to eye. The cartoon sketches, many in Freeport want to be Yarmouth, and in Pownell and Durham, we're rural communities where we can't afford that, and so constant tension over everything about school investment and the like. The lesson in there is these things are most successful when there's been a way that the participants have voluntarily formed their alliances, or else you often get outcomes that aren't all that great. So that's just my remarks on consolidation in general. You got to be pretty clever, like that Utah example of figuring out ways to encourage those things to happen and still have the participants have decided, assessed it, and made it their own. But that therein lie the complexities of trying to regionalize in an environment of strong, autonomous, communitarian assemblages. Mm-hmm.
Anthony, anything to add on that? You think Brookline and Boston are going to merge their school systems anytime soon?
Yeah, I should point out that as you well know, Jeff, Brookline famously resisted the effort to be annexed and be part of Boston. No such consolidations, I think, are in the offing. And yeah, I think that school consolidation, I mean, not to be negative, but it does sort of give a black eye to regionalism because of those instances where, for various reasons, it hasn't worked out. I mean, I think there is some trial and error here. I would also suggest, it may sound superficial, but it's almost a matter of branding. And Jeff, you mentioned the trying to sort of band together the regional transit authorities. If there was some way to communicate to riders, how terrific this is, but with a lot of, not so many acronyms and, the RTPA, and it's so hard to keep track of. As a matter of branding, I think it might be possible to develop ridership for something like that, and really make different communities, sort of feel more a part of a regional system like that. So that's the challenge, or one of the many challenges.
Great, and we're running short on time. We have so many good questions. I want to apologize to the ones I don't get to, but we have time for one or two more. In terms of housing affordability, especially for low-income and workforce housing, what about the role of providing housing so that people can work where they live or live where they work, or have some sort of regional approach to housing? Is there an opportunity for success there? People are so protective of housing in their communities.
Well, I'll jump in and then turn it over to Colin. After the George Floyd murder, a lot of people in Brookline and other places, asked, what can they do? One of the first responses was stop opposing multifamily housing projects in your community. It's a matter of connecting the dots and learning how Black and brown people have really been prevented from growing wealth in terms of home ownership, sort of deflected at every turn, the awful legacy of redlining and so forth, really starting out deep in the hole. So that's how you get from stopping being a NIMBY to racial justice. And it's really simple. Brookings came out with a report showing how more multifamily dense housing and a little bit more density at transit stations, this incredible system of the T that we have in Greater Boston. Again, a regional framework. There are parking lots at most of the stations, or vacant lots, the urgent need for more housing and increasing the housing supply and different kinds of housing options, not just a single family house with all of the legacy there in terms of discrimination and zoning, but multifamily accessory dwelling units, shared equity housing, community land trusts, even manufactured homes. They should all be in the mix as a range of housing options that are appropriate to the different demographics. I think linking all of that to current events might help get people to rethink the sort of, at the ramparts and pulling up the drawbridge reaction that we so often see in our communities.
Great, and I think with that we're out of time. I want to thank Colin and Anthony for offering their thoughts here. It's been really an interesting morning. Logistically, the next step, we're going to be taking a break for 15 minutes. For those of you who are in Biddeford, there's coffee on the sideboard, there's boxed breakfasts in the kitchen, bottled water in the fridge for us, bathrooms out the main door and to the right. We're going to reconvene at 11:30 with a combination of in-person and online groups for discussion, and then Smart Growth Awards over lunch. So thanks very much to our keynotes.